And our question for this week is the beginning of the series of questions that deal with the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Question 40 reads, "What did God at first reveal to man for the rule of his obedience?" The rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law, which is summarily comprehended in the Ten Commandments. This is such an important subject, especially for the modern church, as there is so much confusion regarding this subject of the moral law and as it is comprehended or is summarised in the Ten Commandments. We read in Deuteronomy 10 verse 4, "And he wrote on the tables according to the first writing the Ten Commandments." A very important question that we must ask: are men in general under the moral law? And we must ask this question because there is the idea today that Christ completely did away with the moral law. Is that true? Well, the answer clearly is no. For in Matthew 19:17, the Lord Jesus says, "If thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments." Now we know that nobody can keep the commandments, but man is responsible to keep the commandments. And in fact, James says that if we break the law at one point, we're guilty of breaking it all. That can only be the case if we're still responsible to keep the law. The reason we come to Christ is because we cannot keep the law. But the reason we come to Christ is because we are under the law as the moral law of God. So therefore, if we're asking the question in general, are men in general under the moral law of God? The answer is an emphatic yes. So Christ did not do away with the moral law. He did abrogate the ceremonial and civil laws to some degree, completely the ceremonial laws, and then a lot of the civil laws were abrogated. There's still an application to nations today to uphold some civil laws and some laws regarding, well, they're really moral laws, I suppose, but they're civil in the sense that they affect the nation. But the moral law of God in no way was abrogated by Christ. That just makes no sense. Certainly it was fulfilled for us who believe, which leads us to the second question: are Christians under the moral law? Now Matthew Henry answers this very well. He says, "Are we under the law as a covenant? No. For a man is not justified by the works of the law," Galatians 2 verse 16. So in what sense are we not under the law of God? We're not under the law of God as a covenant whereby we must keep it in order to get to heaven. In that sense, we are not under the law. We are not under the law for justification. But then Matthew Henry goes on to say, are we under it as a rule? Yes, we are under the law to Christ. And he gives a reference, 1 Corinthians 9:21, which reads, Paul explaining his ministry, "To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I may gain them that are without law." So we are not under the law in ourselves for justification, but we are under the law to God under Christ. We are under the law to Christ. Therefore, as Matthew Henry says, it's not as a covenant of salvation, but as a rule for living our lives. We are under the law of God. Wiley, in his history of the church, writes about Luther and says this: "The gospel," he said, "was the only safe path between two abysses. Rome, by usurping authority over the moral law, had opened one abyss. The prophets of Munster, by abrogating that law, had opened another." And what he's saying regarding Luther was there was two wrong views. The view that the Roman Church held, which that they were superior to the law of God, hence doing away with the law in that sense. And then the Anabaptists and the radicals were saying we were no longer in any sense under the law of God. And many evangelicals today follow the radicals and the Anabaptists who were radical in many of their views, and many follow their error. Luther goes on to say, the gospel, by maintaining the supremacy of that law, placed the conscience under the authority of God, its rightful ruler. Now that's an important point. What the gospel does is that it releases us from the law in one sense for justification, but then brings us back to the law, not as something to bring us down, but as by means whereby we can show God how much we love him. That's why the Lord Jesus said that the evidence of loving God is obedience to the commandments. He goes on to say, and so gave man liberty without licentiousness. Do you get that? We have liberty without licentiousness. In other words, we are not keeping the law for salvation. That's liberty. But we're not immune from the law. That is licentiousness. And if the world would avoid falling headlong into the gulf that yawned on either side, two gulfs, two abysses according to Luther, Romanism and radicalism on either side, it must go steadily forward in the road of true evangelicalism. Rome and Munster might seem wide apart, but there was a point where the two met. From the indulgence box of Tetzel came an immunity from moral obligation, quite as complete as that of, quote, the heavenly kingdom of the Anabaptist prophet of Munster. And then finally, an illustration from Whitecross says this: a follower of Pythagoras had bought a pair of shoes from a cobbler, for which he promised to pay him on a future day. On that day he took the money, but finding the cobbler had died in the meanwhile, returned, secretly rejoicing that he could retain the money and get a pair of shoes for nothing. His conscience, however, says Seneca, would allow him no rest, till taking up the money, he went back to the cobbler's shop, and casting the money in, said, Go thy way, for though he is dead to all the world besides, yet he is alive to me. We live in a world where the law of God is dead, where the law of God has been cast aside. But what's worse is that the church has also cast the law of God aside. If we cast it aside, there is no hope for the world. So that's what the world does. The church is not to do the same. So what did God at first reveal to man for the rule of his obedience? The rule which God at first revealed to man for his obedience was the moral law, which is summarily comprehended in the 10 Commandments.